right after the meeting between dictator Putin and United States President Donald Trump in Alaska, and following recent negotiation attempts between Putin and Zelensky, some alarming news emerged. The fact is that both the Americans and the Russians seem to be rattling their nuclear weapons. Of course, no one trusts each other, and all the points of escalation are concentrated specifically in the north. Let me explain what I mean. The United States E-6B Mercury Doomsday plane was spotted on the Arctic ice of Greenland. The American Navy dryly stated, these are routine operations and exercises with nuclear submarines. But it's very important that this plane appears there for the first time in many decades, and this is the northernmost American military base. And during those same days, North American Aerospace Defense Command announced that for the 5th time in a week, they had to scramble fighter jets to intercept a Russian Il-20 reconnaissance plane in the air defense identification zone near Alaska. Russian reconnaissance planes are now flying much more actively near Alaska, reports say. And here comes the intrigue. What is this Arctic knot? The Americans are checking while the Russian aircraft, is probing the edge of American defenses. Let's clarify this story. Briefly, the Americans suddenly moved the Doomsday plane. This is the command base for nuclear forces at the northernmost point of their fleet, and the Russians are actively probing American defenses in Alaska. My name is Alexei Pechi. Today is August 28th. Next, everything in order. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like the video, leave any comment, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. So first about Mercury. This is not a bomber, it's not some kind of spy plane, it's an airborne nuclear deterrence command post, an aircraft that's supposed to communicate with nuclear submarines even if everything on Earth has gone dark. Petokik received a brief statement from the United States Navy. The Pacific Fleet confirms that the E-6B is conducting routine operations and exercises with nuclear submarines. Well, to put it in plain language, it's a routine check of the last communication line. But the location makes this routine an event, because the Doomsday plane is being moved to the Petokik base. This is the northernmost, this is the American post from where both the Atlantic and all Arctic routes are covered. For such an aircraft, Greenland is a rare point where it ever stops, and that's exactly why this movement was noticed. The Doomsday plane hasn't appeared in Greenland for many years. Now the second half of the picture, which we shouldn't lose sight of. A Russian Il-20 is entering the danger zone near Alaska. Air defense identification is international airspace, but there, everyone is tracked very precisely. And so North American Aerospace Defense Command has recorded several incidents over the past week. On August 24, they detected and tracked one Il-20 scrambled an E-3 F-16 and KC-135. On August 26, the same scenario, the same Il-20, at the same time, Stars and Stripes summarizes, the Russian Il-20 entered the air defense identification zone, and the aircraft had to scramble for interception. Columbia Broadcasting System News writes that this is already the 4th incident in the past week. So this is basically a classic game of nerves. Technically, no one is crossing the border, but frequent flybys create a certain atmosphere. And against this backdrop, Mercury, the American Doomsday plane, lands on the ice. This is, the mystery of the moment. It's not that someone is preparing for the end of the world, but that directly north. The answer is straightforward. The Arctic is a node of strategic connectivity. Here, the routes of nuclear submarines converge, as well as windows for long-range reconnaissance aircraft and the so-called Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom arc, where historically, any attempts to slip through are caught, as they say. That's it. And if you have a Russian Il-20 in your air defense identification zone for several days in a row, you don't hold loud press conferences. It's all very quiet. You just check the latest tracking data. So you send a Doomsday plane to Greenland to check, if you will, the communication with the nuclear submarines. That means you need to check the stability of the relay, interaction with the stations on the ice, and so on. That's the whole point of the so-called routine deployment of the E-6BBV-5 aircraft now, in plain language. What is an air defense identification zone? This is not a territory of the United States of America. It's a buffer zone in international airspace where everyone is required to identify themselves. If you enter, you must state who you are and your reason for being there. And the Americans emphasize in every release that there was no violation of sovereign airspace, but they did visual identification. For this, they scrambled F-16S, brought in an E-3, and supported them with KC-135 tankers. This formula has been around since the 2010s, but in recent days it's been repeated more often. And it's being reported that there were 3 interceptions in 5 days, then a 4th interception, then a 5th interception. This is getting very strange. This means that the American military on duty now have frequent alerts on their radars. They see a Russian reconnaissance plane entering their airspace 5 times in a week. And that's why there's an Arctic check of American communications. No longer seems like a show, more like a precaution. What does all this mean for Ukraine and Europe? Well, you know, it's a very utilitarian thing. It's the confidence of the Allies. Recently, the White House has more often used the phrase economic pressure instead of world war. Trump stated that it's better for us to put economic pressure on Russia than to get involved in a world war. Well, and Europe is openly discussing security guarantees for Ukraine. I've already explained how they will work. And such an architecture, the architecture relies on a simple condition. The strategic rear, the strategic back must be secured. And the Arctic is part of that rear. When the last cable to the boats is checked, there where it's cold, noisy, and so on, it's easier for everyone to breathe and not flex their muscles unnecessarily. That's why the EB-6 plane in Patuxent is exactly about that. Not about escalation, but about reliability. To be clear, I'll quote both sides briefly and directly. So, the United States Navy says the EB-6 plane is carrying out routine operations and exercises with nuclear submarines. The radar reports detecting and tracking one Il-20 in the Air Defense Identification Zone, scrambling an E-3 F-16 and KC-135. These 2 statements anchor the information. Americans monitor the perimeter, while Russians test response limits. And it's in everyone's interest for this to remain at the level of cold routine, not some hot headlines. This deserves attention. Well, let's fantasize for a second within the bounds of reality. What exactly are the Americans testing in the north? First, it's the horror, the stability of communication with nuclear submarines under Arctic ionospheric conditions. That's something you can't simulate in Oklahoma, where there's also a military base. Second, it's the reaction time. This is very important because there's North American Aerospace Defense Command and there are allies along the arc: Great Britain, Greenland, Iceland. You need to determine who takes off, how many, in what order, which planes take off, who provides cover until refueling, how track exchange and communication work, and more. Third, this is a signal to the recipients, in this case the Russians, that everything in our north is working. We can deal with sanctions and guarantees without arguing about the big buttons. So, like Trump says, we don't want a third world war, but it's better to check just in case. If a Russian Il-20 flies by again tomorrow, the response will be just as boring. Detected, escorted, no violations. Unfortunately, there's such stability in this boredom. Why is it important to emphasize this now? Because at the same time, there is political turbulence going on. Some people in Europe dream of a quick peace. Someone in Moscow is selling an imminent breakthrough. And in Kiev, unfortunately, there are air raid sirens because the Russians continue to strike Ukraine. Against this backdrop, any split in strategic unity lets populists argue America is self-absorbed and unconcerned about Ukraine. As you know, the Russians aren't sending their Il-20s without a reason. It's closer to Alaska's border, so Americans might say, "What Ukraine? The Russians are already next to us. What are you thinking? Do we need to deal with this?" And accordingly, the deployment of the Americans' Doomsday plane in Greenland is, a quiet antivirus against all this rhetoric. This doesn't require any briefings, press conferences, statements, or anything like that. A Navy confirmation and a few dry press releases are enough for everything to fall into place. That the shield is up, nerves in the north are under control, the economy and security guarantees are all a priority. What's the bottom line? In Greenland, there's Mercury, and in the American Air Defense Identification Zone, Russian Il-20s. The news is full of such boring press releases saying that nothing is happening. That's actually a good scenario. The bad one is when people in the North start using slogans. For now, the Americans are keeping the North in check. It's easier for the Allies to think about sanctions against Russians, sanctions against the Russian shadow fleet, secondary sanctions on Russian banks, strengthening air defense for Ukraine, a European ground military mission in Ukraine, and so on. And it's harder for Moscow to play its card in the northern direction. Like, look, they have problems there and so on. And if you sum it all up in one phrase, then of course nothing apocalyptic is happening. This prevention occurs amid frequent Russian Il-20 flights near Alaska. And yes, it's exactly this kind of boring north that is actually beneficial for us. And why do I say boring? That's how American news outlets are trying to portray it right now, so I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's it for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.